Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to call to order this meeting of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights as we continue our study into Bill C-305, an act to amend the Criminal Code, mischief. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Arnold to our committee for the first time. Welcome, Mr. Arnold. And I'd like to welcome Ms. Scrow to our committee for the first time. Welcome, Ms. Scrow. Oh, it's a pleasure having you both here. And it's also a pleasure having our witnesses today. Representing B'nai B'rith, Canada, we have Michael Mostyn, who is the Chief Executive Officer. Welcome, Mr. Mostyn. And for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, we have Richard Marceau, who is the General Counsel and Senior Political Advisor. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir, Monsieur Marceau.
It's a great pleasure to welcome you. And now we'll begin with Mr. Mostyn.
Mr. Mostyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Established in 1875, B'nai B'rith is Canada's most senior membership-based Jewish organization. Through its League for Human Rights, it is the premier advocate for Canada's grassroots Jewish community. B'nai B'rith operates a hotline to assist the victims of anti-Semitism and racism on a daily basis. We are here today to discuss Bill C-305, whose aim is to close a gap in the criminal code by extending the legal protection afforded to houses of worship to a wide variety of other property critical to our community lives from mischief. It is very hard to come by proper statistics in this matter, and the case law regarding how hate-motivated acts of mischief against religious sites are prosecuted is confusing, and I will further elaborate on that shortly. There is no question that this is a very well-intentioned bill, and it is indeed very heartening to see all party support against the hate-fueled bigotry that has been receiving more media attention over the last number of months. In fact, the backgrounds of the many diverse groups who have spoken in favor of this bill further reflects the multicultural nature of our great country. Similarly, the Jewish community has always sought strong laws to protect all Canadians from all identifiable backgrounds from the purveyors of hatred. Although it may sound hard to believe, given our relatively small numbers in Canada, the Jewish community remains the most targeted community group for hate crimes in this country. StatsCan reported in 2013 that there were 181 hate-motivated crimes targeting the Jewish religion reported by police, or an estimated rate of 54.9 police-reported hate crimes per 100,000. By comparison, police reported 65 crimes motivated by hatred against the Muslim religion in 2013, representing an estimated rate of 6.2 hate crimes per 100,000. So assuming the Canadian Jewish population in 2013 was 350,000 and the Canadian Muslim population was approximately 1 million, taking the respective sizes of the two communities into account, Canadian Jews were approximately 8 times more likely than Canadian Muslims to be the victims of hate crime in that year. B'nai B'rith's annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents shows that anti-Semitism in Canada has remained relatively constant since 2011. With no active conflict occurring in Israel in 2015, 1,277 incidents were reported that year. Vandalism declined to a 15-year low in that year. We had 136 incidents reported, considerably off the 5-year average. Just yesterday in Toronto, it was reported that units in a condo building, home to a large number of Jewish people, were the victims of anti-Semitism. Yellow post-it notes were slapped on some of their doors. Certain notes had pictures of Nazi swastikas, while others read "No Jews." Some of the residents also had their mezuzah stolen. A mezuzah is affixed to the doorpost of every Jewish home and holds religious prayers inside the case from the Torah. However, even with the amendments proposed by Bill C-305, this section would not apply to this particular hate crime of mischief because a private condominium is not within the scope of the properties being considered for amendment. Jewish individuals are perhaps somewhat unique in this way, as the mezuzah is a year-round religious act of self-identification at their home. However, a strong argument can be made that a hate crime at one's home is even more traumatic to the victim than one in a communal setting. Recently, B'nai B'rith tried laying charges in another mischievous act of bias against our community, unsuccessfully. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME, have placed stickers promoting the boycott of Israel on items for sale in stores across Canada, a clear case of bias based on national origin. There have been to date no mischief charges laid, despite CJPME actually filming themselves doing it, which is why we complained to police, since there was evidence in the video of the perpetrator. We wrote the federal government in this matter, and we are still awaiting an answer. The police advised us that their hands were tied unless the store owners themselves were to complain. But that is not correct. Even though the store owner is the real victim in these instances, the entire Jewish community of Canada was victimized by these acts. Sadly, our community has been ignored in this case. It is not enough for us to want justice to be done. Justice must be done, and justice must ultimately be seen to be done by all Canadians to retain high levels of societal support for our criminal justice system. Generally speaking, in Canada, the Criminal Code contains a number of different and long-standing offences to deal with the general topic of hate crime. It is a hate crime in Canada if an act is committed to intimidate, harm, or terrify not only a person, but an entire group of people to which the victim belongs. The act has to be motivated by hate and can involve intimidation, harassment, physical force, or threat of physical force. In February of 2016, B'nai B'rith exposed an editorial in Al Furqan, an Arabic language newspaper in Windsor, which described attacks against civilians in Israel as a sacred duty of jihad. No charges were laid. B'nai B'rith has spoken out against Alfred Schleifer for online videos in which he glorifies Adolf Hitler, describes Jewish people as parasites, and accuses them of conspiring to eliminate the European race. No charges were laid in Canada. Authorities in Germany recently laid charges against Schleifer after B'nai B'rith alerted German officials. There are many other examples. The mischief section of the Criminal Code covers hate-motivated mischief to religious property in subsection 4.1 by defining specific property as religious and provides for a harsher sentence than mischief involving other property. The proposed amendments add gender identity or sexual orientation to the motivation for bias in section 434.1. In sub 4.101, it also proposes adding further properties to the definition in the section so that if a similar act of hate is committed against any building primarily used as a university or college, daycare center, community center, or a senior's residence, the punishment provisions of section 430 would also apply. B'nai B'rith is one of the premier providers of affordable housing for seniors in Canada, so better than most, we certainly appreciate the thought behind this bill on behalf of our more than 1,000 residents. But the question remains, what will the potential impact be in the real world from these proposed amendments, and how will it keep people more safe from targeted acts of hate? Some of the confusion in the application of the law is likely the result of section 718.2 of the Code, which encourages judges to consider whether the crime was motivated by hate of the victim's race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, etc. This section can be used to increase the sentencing provisions of general mischief. Oddly, after an exhaustive search, we were able to find only a single case on Westlaw of anyone being convicted or sentenced under section 434.1, the existing religious property provision. In the case of Reza Hari, the accused was convicted of uttering death threats and spray painting a number of churches under the section 434.1. His trial was unreported and he was found not guilty by reason of mental disorder. There are also very few reported cases of mischief to property, including aggravated factors as described in section 718.2. Some of those cases would not have access to the amended provision being considered by this committee, such as the case of R. Mackenzie, where the accused pled guilty to willful promotion of hatred and mischief after he spray painted "Kill Muslims" and "Kill Syrians" in various areas of Calgary with large Muslim Syrian populations. Section 718.2A1 was mentioned as an aggravating factor for the mischief offenses in that case. However, the confusion in terms of what charges are laid is illustrated well in the case of R. versus Coleman, where the accused pled guilty to a variety of offenses that took place in 2010, including spray painting threatening messages on a mosque. He was convicted and sentenced for mischief with hate as an aggravating factor, but there was no charge under section 434.1, even though it clearly applied to the facts of that case. So why aren't there more prosecutions of mischief to religious property on the record? There might be no instances of mischief to religious property in Canada. That would be wonderful, but I think we can all acknowledge that this is not true. Perhaps local police forces and Crown attorneys prosecuted under the general mischief section and use sentencing provisions as an aggravating factor because they believe, perhaps, that it might be easier to obtain a conviction by not dealing with intent as an element of the offense. It is very likely that there were guilty pleas made by accused, but we were unable to see this data because it is not recorded by any of the case law recording companies. Perhaps the number of incidents were low, or accused persons were not caught or prosecuted. Perhaps police did not lay charges, or evidence of hate bias were not put forward. Another issue with the wording of this amendment is, what does it mean to say that the impugned property has to be primarily used for in the various subsections? There are public schools, that are used after hours by religious groups by renting out public space for, say, Sunday school programming. The public school is not primarily used for religious instruction, but certainly if the amendments are to protect religious individuals and groups from hate, then why would it matter that a public school is not being primarily used by those individuals? There are serious concerns about anti-Semitism and other forms of systemic racism in Canada. Canadians want to see charges and successful prosecutions when hate is a motivating bias in criminal acts towards identifiable minority groups. If this bill does not in actual fact increase the scope of the law to protect targeted communities from hate, because Section 434.1 as it currently exists is not being regularly used, then we must ask ourselves, why are we considering these amendments? There may be very good reasons, and these amendments may indeed fill a true gap in the law, but it is not obvious from an analysis of the existing case law. I do have some recommendations, but perhaps if there's questions later, I can get to those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mostyn. And now we'll go over to Monsieur Marceau.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank the members of this committee for their invitation, and I'd like to thank Chandra Arya for tabling this bill, C-305. All members of all parties supported it at second reading, and this is something that has been important and is important for the Jewish community for a long time. Now, I'd like to talk about how C-305 came into being without taking anything away from Mr. Arya's merit in bringing it forward. Quite the contrary. When I was a critic for justice of my political party, I was approached by the Jewish community to make sure that the suggestions of protection for places of worship and cemeteries under Section 430.4.1 of the Criminal Code, and for schools and community centers, vulnerable groups, that these places be protected. So this was brought forward, but the election was triggered on January 23, 2006, an election I lost. Then another member, Carol Freeman, who had hired my assistant, Patrick Saint-Jacques, brought it forward under the 39th legislature. It was then called C-384, but then the following election of 2008 was triggered and Ms. Freeman lost. Then a Liberal MP, Marlene Jennings, took up the bill. In the 40th Parliament, it was then called C-451, and it had broad support from all political parties, but Marlene lost in 2011. During the 41st Parliament, the bill was then taken up by Marc Garneau. It was then called C-510, but it didn't get very far, even though it had broad support among MPs. So this bill has been around about 10 years. We've been studying it, and finally we can see some light at the end of the tunnel.
To extend the property already given to houses of worship and cemeteries to other buildings and structure used by communities at risk. Our community, the Jewish community, has often been the target of vandalism. As Michael mentioned, Jewish Canadians are victimized by hate-motivated crime at a higher rate than any other identifiable group. Stats Canada data shows that roughly 3/4 of these crimes fall under the legal category of mischief, broadly speaking, the vandalism or destruction of property. Vandalism on community centers and schools are more than attacks on buildings. They reverberate throughout the community. They reverberate throughout a city. It touches every member of a community, whether this person goes frequently to that place or not. That is why it must be seriously punished. The bill extends the protection by defining the word property for the purposes of sub 4.1 as being a building or structure or part of a building or structure that is primarily used for religious worship, that is primarily used as an educational institution, primarily used for administrative, social, cultural, sports activities or events, including a town hall, community center, playground, or arena, or that is primarily used as a residence for seniors. I understand that there are concerns about the bill being too broad, more specifically about the groups afforded protection in sub 4.1, and about which building would be covered. Let me tackle one at a time. The fact is that the subsection is about mischief relating to religious property. And I've heard some concerns about extending it to cover buildings associated, for example, with the LGBTQ plus community would denature the subsection. We at CIJA have no problem extending protections to the LGBTQ plus community buildings. Our long-standing advocacy in this area, including our deep involvement and support of C-16, previously C-279 brought forward by Randall Garrison, speaks for itself. I don't think the principle of inclusion with regard to the LGBTQ plus community is at issue. The question maybe is whether these protections should be included in the same subsection, thus changing its nature, or should they be extended to the LGBTQ plus community buildings in a different subsection. To the Jewish community, the how, which subsection, matters less than the what, that is, that these institutions be covered and better protected. As for the issue of the bill being too broad regarding which buildings would fall under the subsection, I disagree. What about, for example, a synagogue, a mosque, or a temple which rents space in a mall? Shouldn't it be protected? How about the social services agency of a community which rents space in an office building? Today, the Jewish social services agencies from across Canada are on the Hill, meeting MPs and ministers to discuss the issues around disability. They would tell you, and rightly so, that they would like and need their offices covered. À une époque où Sayed al-Ghitouani, un imam du Centre islamique Al-Andalus de Montréal,
At a time when an imam from an Islamic center in Montreal has been calling for the destruction of Jews, begging Allah to destroy the Jews one by one and make their children orphans and their women widows, and he is supported by his mosque. Also, when Igor Sadikov tweets about Punch a Zionist Day, brutally intimidating Jewish students at McGill at a time, we're talking about February 6, 2017, where a timesheet on Google about for a swimming team was hacked and
in prayer, at a time when a wave of hate vandalism hit many religious and community institutions in Ottawa, including the community center where my sons work and the synagogue I'm a member of, it is time to send a strong signal that anti-Semitism, anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh bigotry, and all other forms of hatred have no place in Canada. That schools and community centers are as central to minorities' lives as houses of worship or cemeteries, and that mischief on those buildings should be seriously punished. I encourage all members of Parliament to continue support for C-305 and to pass that bill without delay. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Marceau. And now we're going to move to questions. We're going to go to Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mostyn and Mr. Marceau, for your testimony. I certainly agree with your presentations that this legislation is certainly a well-intentioned piece of legislation. I believe that it closes a gap in the criminal code. Both of you alluded to the fact that we have seen in recent years a string of incidents in which people have been targeted at their homes, at their synagogues, at their mosques, but also at their schools, at their community centers. We saw the firebombing of the United Talmud Torah School in Montreal. We saw just recently, a few months ago, in Ottawa, where there had been a string of incidents that included 2 synagogues, as well as a mosque. But it also included a Jewish teaching center, and it included the Ottawa Muslim Association. The offenses were motivated by the same hate. They were an attack on entire communities to perpetuate fear. The nature of the crimes that were committed at each of those sites was similar, but yet, depending on where certain acts of vandalism occurred, they may be subject to the general section or the specific section with very different penalties. One up to a 10-year sentence, the other for up to 2 years. So I certainly agree that there is an inconsistency and that this legislation would help close that inconsistency. One of the questions that I do have in terms of the wording of the proposed section 4.101 is that if you look at A, it refers to a place of religious worship, including a church, mosque, synagogue, and so on. But after that, if you look at B, C, and D, there is no mention of religion. So it's not necessarily limited to a religious educational facility or a religious administrative building or community hall or a religious, a senior's residence, a Muslim or Jewish senior's residence, for example. Do you have any thoughts on those three clauses of the bill from the standpoint that although the purpose of the section relates to religious property, those three parts would actually expand it well beyond that?
Do you want to go? Or do you want me to go? Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for your question. And many of the Jewish communities and institutions are not religious by nature. The Jewish Community Center usually is not a place of worship. Sometimes some space is rented by a congregation for a little while, for bigger events. For example, during Jewish high holidays, taking the Ottawa JCC, for example, some synagogue would rent spaces, but usually it is not associated with the Jewish religion, but it's very associated with the Jewish community. That's where some Jewish studies happening there. There are some Jewish sports team, and the definition of property here would apply to the JCC, even though there's no religious institution, there's no religious activities per se, and that is, I think, where the gap that you have identified at the beginning of your question shows, and where it's important to be filled. Same thing for a cultural or sports activity. I'd say the Seagull Center in Montreal, which is a Jewish theater company, that, let's say, it's very identifiable as being Jewish. Under the current subsection 4.1, it would not be covered, even though the motivation for attacking the Seagull Center in Montreal would be anti-Jewish. So I think that wording covers those kinds of places, and an attack on a Jewish community center reverberates as much as an attack on the JCC or a Jewish cultural institution.
Well, I certainly support the bill. It's really just a matter of looking at the specific wording in the bill to see whether or not any amendments are required. Do either of you have any suggestions as far as amendments are concerned, or are you satisfied with the bill in its present form?
Sure, I'll speak to that for a moment. So, in the way that the bill is currently drafted, on subsections 4.101 A to D, it uses the term primarily used for all of these different sorts of properties that are stated in the bill.
Sorry, where are you referring?
If you're looking at A to D in the amendments, there's
A
in
to D,
quotations.
sorry,
Yeah,
I
there's
thought-
quotations
yeah.
primarily used for before each of these areas. So primarily used for this, primarily used for that. And I guess the question that the committee should consider is why are those specific terms being used? Because as I mentioned in my testimony earlier, you might have any number of institutions that you have part-time. Richard mentioned in a Jewish community center. It could be any sort of a property that you have part-time, say a religious school or other things, Sunday schools. So An alternative description could be substantially used or regularly used for, because those properties may be primarily used for other purposes, yet you still want to protect those buildings so that you have fairness in terms of the way that the law is being applied.
Thank you for that. Mr. Marceau, any suggestions?
No, I actually like Michael's idea. That's one I would seriously consider. But otherwise, I am fine with the bill as is, with the caveat, as I mentioned earlier, the LGBTQ building community centers. Should they be the same subsection that is subtitle religious property, or should it be? Or should be in another subsection? It's of no consequences to us. We believe that as a community at risk, it should be protected. Now, the other thing that I would mention is that taking or making the assumption that Bill C-16 will pass the Senate this session, we should make sure that the wording of C-305 is consistent with Bill C-16 that was passed by the House, is now considered by the other place.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biddle.
I'd like to thank you both for coming today. It's quite poignant that you're here testifying to this bill, especially in light of the incidents that you mentioned, including the anti-Semitism on display in North York. Mr. Mostyn, you mentioned that you had recommendations. Was it just that one point, or do you have further recommendations that you'd like to share with the committee?
Well, thank you very much. Some of the other recommendations that I do have is that the committee should be listening to police and attorney generals, consulting with them as to why it's not on the public record, a history of case law with respect to the original section here. As I had mentioned, in sentencing, 718.2AI can increase the sentencing up to 10 years for general mischief. So are there guilty pleas that are taking place? It's hard to understand, I guess, from a civil society perspective, exactly why police may or may not be issuing charges. One thing, though, that is of concern, and Richard was talking about other anti-Semitic incidents that are targeting our community, is that from our community perspective, being that most targeted group, we want to ensure that our community feels safe. All Canadians want to make sure that all Canadians, regardless of religious background, regardless of any identifiable background, are safe, and that the law is being applied, and that there's no double standards in the laws. So, but without consultations of some sort on that, as I mentioned, it's very strange and odd, because there really isn't much of a case law record with respect to this particular section, which came about in 2001.
So I'm sorry if this comes off the wrong way, but I just want to clarify it. So in terms of, and there is support for this bill clearly, but I guess my concern is, do you fear that this is, and perhaps this is for both of you, that this is symbolic of the Parliament, and that due to issues with enforcement, that there may not be a belief in your community that there's an increase in safety and protection of targeted communities or targeted groups? If that.
Well, I actually think that police forces are doing amazing work in Canada. We saw it in Ottawa, where when the JCC and the synagogues and the mosque were attacked, police reacted vigorously, and we were very grateful to them. If somebody thinks that Bill C-305 is a panacea and will solve any problem, it's not the case. It is one tool out of the toolbox. There's hate crime legislation. There is a SIP program that was put into place by the Conservatives and renewed by the Liberal government, and we're very grateful to the government for that. And it is a whole new it's a whole approach, holistic, organic approach that is needed. One thing that we mentioned in the whole debate over the elimination of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act under the previous Parliament was that if Parliament wanted to go in that direction, there was a necessity to make sure that Crown prosecutors and Attorney Generals would bring prosecutions under, I think it's 318, 319 of the Criminal Code more often and more vigorously. Which we haven't seen yet. So there's space to have a debate on what to do and how to make sure that hate speech and hate crimes are fought vigorously in Canada. And C-305 is but one element in the whole thing.
And if I can just jump in quickly, just to support my friend here, it's interesting to note that those hate crimes that just took place in Ottawa, there were charges under that original section of Section 430 sub 4. So it is being used, right? It's just that the question is there data to properly understand that? The police do great jobs in this country. They do great work for all Canadians. And but once again, maybe there should be guidelines to help instruct police when charges should or should not be laid under certain sections.
If I might just complete the answer. So last Friday, the perpetrator of the hate crimes in Ottawa was pled guilty to the charges. His name cannot be mentioned because he was a month short of his 18th birthday, but it was prosecuted. The police and the Crown Attorney took it very, very seriously and was quite satisfied with the way it was handled.
And perhaps a question that's a little bit out of the bounds of this hearing because we're focusing on 305, and I'm hoping I won't be ruled out of order, but are there, I guess, either amendments to this bill or other amendments to the criminal code that you see that would increase the effectiveness of enforcement?
In order.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're very welcome.
He's a generous chair.
Reasons, please, reasons.
Well, I didn't prepare for other sections, but I mean, speaking very generally to that, is there room for improvement? There's always room for improvement. Certainly, I know that police forces all across the country are doing a much better job nowadays reaching out to all community groups of all backgrounds, trying to understand better where they're coming from. But my suggestion is not so much changes through the criminal code, but also, you know, focusing on the fact that police, their role is to protect and serve. And there's a number of police forces that are hiring now public relations firms and getting out into community groups, and that's all wonderful and that's all great. But the primary purpose is to keep all communities safe. And there are sections in the criminal code, 318, 319 require consent of the Attorney General. There's always been some talk in not just the Jewish community, but in other communities, whether sometimes for political correctness, politicians will want to charge certain groups or not for certain offenses, depending on how it plays out in the media. So it's a matter of, I guess, just constant study and constant vigor, and every community in Canada standing up for every other community and ensuring that intolerance and hatred is not stood up for.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Biddle. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the committee, and it's good to see you again, Mr. Marceau, after we exchanged ideas on Bill S-201 last year. Mr. Mostyn, I just wanted to go to your testimony. I didn't catch the amendments that you had suggested for the term primarily used. Can you just go over those again, please?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I had just suggested changing the wording from primarily used for,
yeah,
which are the three words that are in the subsections, and suggesting an alternative description, because I don't think this is where you want to get really narrow. Mm-hmm. I think this is where you actually want to be broad. If a property is being targeted for hate and hate bias, right, for that mischief, you want to make sure that it's, you know, a broader capture, I think. Mm-hmm. So if I just suggested two terms, either the use of the term substantially or regularly rather than the word primarily. Okay. And I think if you were to insert that terminology, you may get a capture of broadening properties that should be protected under legislation such as this.
Thank you. And then in your also when you were talking about the lack of case law, that was with respect to Section 718.2? Was it like the lack of a history, or?
So Section 718.2A, that's the punishment position that can come into sentencing. So when we look through that as it applied to general mischief, there are a few cases, but not so many on record, in particular that are applying to mischief to property for religious institutions that we're considering here today. But to Richard's point, listen, you had somebody pleading guilty just this past week. That's something that's not going to be recorded or captured. Right. That lawyers are going to be able to take a look at and analyze. So it's very possible that with the use of this section and with video cameras that are out there today, and many of our targeted communities unfortunately have to have video cameras and surveillance and security at all of these institutions, it may also be the fact that sometimes people are caught red-handed and they just plead guilty because they know that they did it and they're not going to fight it.
So basically, like, even though like a judge, when sentencing, can take into account those aggravating factors to increase the sentence, like you still feel that C-305 is closing some necessary loopholes that exist. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Just getting it in the record so when we deliberate over the clause-by-clause section of the bill. One part that I asked our sponsor, the sponsor of the bill, and I think some reference was made to it. Mr. Mostyn, you referenced the fact that, some of the crimes that could result from this bill being passed, they may actually be considered worse than doing something to someone's private home. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have some suggestions? Like, if someone was to like spray paint racist or religiously motivated graffiti on a park bench, that could net them a harsher sentence than if they did it in someone's home. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have suggestions for the committee on how we proceed with respect to this bill?
Sure. Well, yeah. I don't think the park bench would be covered.
Well, but if it's within the grounds of a piece of property listed within,
correct.
Yes, it would be.
It could be. Yeah.
Yeah.
It could. Well, sure. Yeah. In that example, but the reason I raised that example of the anti-Semitism that took place in North York is because our community, the Jewish community, does in fact sort of self-identify 365 days a year that it's a Jewish household because of the fact that we have mezuzahs. It's not often, with many religious groups, there's a seasonal identification. You might put a wreath on the, around Christmas time. There's other religious ways, but our community is vulnerable to this. And now, you could use the existing mischief with the 718 provision, and you could still get that up to 10 years. So, the opportunity is there to allow for a degree of fairness. But again, it's something that the committee should consider because, where does it go from a seniors building to to a building that has a large amount of identifiable groups? Certain condominiums, this condominium that was targeted has a lot of Jewish residents, but it's not a Jewish residence. It's just the fact that many people of the same faith live in the same building, and I would imagine that's pretty common across all religious groups in Canada.
And just a quick final question to both of you. If you go to section 4.101 and you look at subsection C, it talks about a building being used for administrative purposes. I had some concern that, like, do you think we need to define that term? Because a lot of buildings are used for administrative purposes, whether they fall within one of these specified groups or not. But if someone of some sort of religious background or ethnic background works at an administrative building, at CIBC, and it's spray painted with graffiti, do you think that could be? Are we casting the net too wide if we don't define that specific term? Just your thoughts on that.
Property inception in 4.101 makes reference to 4.1. And then it talks about motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on religion, race, color, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not every administrative building that would be caught into it. And I guess the clearest example I can give you, let's say like the Jewish Family Services of Town X has an office in an administrative building. I think that should be covered because the reason why it would be targeted under this section is because it's identified as being Jewish.
Yeah.
And if I could just add to that, I think that it's very likely that would occur because if the commission of the mischief is motivated by bias and they have to show that as an essential element of the offense, why would the police charge somebody when they know I have less chance of a conviction than going through the regular general mischief section? So I think that's very unlikely to happen.
Okay, great. Thank you both.
Very much. Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming in today and giving a very compelling testimony. First off, I want to start by saying how disheartening and how disgusted I felt hearing about the North York. I would say it's an attack on a personal home of individuals, and I was speaking to the member from Willowdale whose riding it happened in, and he said that, speaking to the lady, she said that, it's only expected, which I think disgusts me even more, because no, it should not be expected, and we need to do everything that we can to protect all communities, and it's troubling, and I think that our government must do more. You also mentioned the imam that spoke in the sermon, and I think that's also disgusting behavior. We need to do more to really keep our communities together, which really brings me to the intent of this bill, which is to stop these kinds of acts, which is to stop vandalism, etc. And so I wonder then, do you think that this amendment to the criminal code will enhance deterrence? Will people actually be stopped with the addition of this provision within our criminal code? And I would ask both of your comments, please.
You go first. Sure. Do I think it's actually going to stop the hate? No, I don't, unfortunately. I don't know, unfortunately, what criminal code provisions you can propose that's going to stop the hate. Certain individuals are prejudiced and act out their bias against identifiable groups. And that is not something that the criminal code alone can deal with. Education has to happen. All sorts of initiatives, and even then, there will always be, and that's the reason why we have the criminal code. The fact that there are more severe punishments, to those who understand it, could act as a bit more of a deterrent. I think in cases like this, unfortunately, I think that's more what has to be considered.
Yeah, I would agree with Michael's statement on that. It's both a deterrent, it's also a strong signal, and let's not underestimate the power of statements by parliamentarians, of people here in this building voting and saying something. It has a very power, and it reverberates throughout the country. But will it stop? Unfortunately, no. Many things have been illegal for centuries and are still happening, but the message still needs to be done. It still needs to be sent, and the punishment still needs to be applied.
I know we've talked about punishments a little bit today, and the police being hesitant in pressing charges where there's an additional element to be proven. For example, general mischief versus specific one. Do you think there's anything that we can do to encourage the police to then also give more precedence to this specific section in the code as opposed to the more general one?
Well, some police forces around the country, not all of them, have hate crimes units. hate crimes units, and those units tend to be better informed and more aware of the tools that are included in the criminal code. Ottawa has one, BC has one, but not every police force across the country. So there needs to be, I would suggest that message to be sent, and two, making sure that police officers and crime attorneys dealing with hate crimes and such be more aware of how better to fight crimes that way.
Thank you. And there have been some concerns that were raised here today, and then also when this bill was debated in the House about the broadness of the bill. Mr. Chair, if it's okay with you, can we please ask for the government's position, Mr. Mendicino?
I'm looking to the chair for his ruling the same way that he provided one with Mr. Biddle, but I'm certainly prepared to briefly outline the
I think
position.
for that one, for you to intervene, we simply have to have consent. Is there consent to have Mr. Mendicino provide what the government's position is? Agreed. So please provide it.
I appreciate the committee's cooperation, and thank you, Mr. Chair. First, let me just pick up on two comments which were made by my colleagues, Mr. Biddle and Ms. Khalid. I do think that it's poignant that you're here today, especially given the some of the issues that we have been debating both today and will continue to debate in the coming weeks around religious discrimination and the need to call it for what it is. And I want to commend Ms. Khalid for bringing her motion. And let me just take a moment as well to say that the incident of anti-Semitism in North York hits very close to home. Mr. Mostyn, you know that my riding is very close to that neighborhood, and I worked very closely with the community there, and was quite alarmed and disturbed to see that incident. And so hopefully the authorities will be able to pursue their investigation vigorously. The government's position is generally supportive of the objectives of this bill. And it's precisely because of the reasons that I just articulated. The original intent of section, just want to make sure I get the original number correct, 434.1 was to identify mischief relating to religious property. And that section expressly articulates a number of building structures where, if the mischief occurs, it would attract a more stiff sentencing regime. My colleague, Mr. Chandra's private member's bill, Bill C-305, would seek to expand both the grounds as well as the categories of buildings and structures which would attract this more stiff sentencing regime. So in general, the government supports those objectives. Where we would offer some additional comment for the purposes of the committee's deliberations is around the categories of secular buildings to which the sentencing regime would apply. If one goes back and reflects on the original intent of Parliament around Section 4.1, certainly there was a focus there around religious property. That is not to say that there aren't other categories of buildings and structures that are used for other purposes, and I think Monsieur Marceau provided some testimony regarding, for example, the JCC Community Centre, which is not used primarily for religious purposes, but where if mischief or hate speech was targeted at, that there should be, an appropriately stiff sentence following conviction. Our response to that is certainly under 718.2 that a trial judge or a sentencing judge could consider as an aggravating factor the cultural identity and other identities which should attract additional protection and denunciation in the context of that particular phase of the trial process. So it doesn't rule out, assuming that the categories of buildings remain focused on buildings which are used primarily for religious purposes, it doesn't rule out that a sentencing judge could use their discretion to nevertheless sentence someone appropriately and more stiffly in the JCC hypothetical that you provided. The other thing that I would just point out, Mr. Chair, is that I appreciate Mr. Mostyn's comments regarding trying to clarify what should be the appropriate threshold for triggering the more stiff sentencing regime under Bill C-305, and his suggestion that we move from using primarily used for to substantially or regularly used. My only comment is that I think that on reflection, substantially or regularly might be even more subjective than primarily used for. So, I mean, I think that as the committee reflects on where these amendments should land, certainly hopefully that evidence will be helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mendicino and Ms. Khalid. I mean, we could just say used for as well without any modifier. I mean, in the end, if something's used for something and there's a hate crime, but in the end, it's something to deliberate. We're not there yet. So again, thank you, Ms. Khalid. Now, we don't have time for a whole other round, but I'd like to go to the members who have smaller questions to allow them to ask those smaller questions. So I know Ms. Crow had one, and I think you had one, Mr. Arnold, and Mr. Falk. Okay, so let's go to Mr. Falk, then Ms. Crow. Mr. Falk?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Ms. Khalid was talking about when she began, and she talked about deterrence. What do you see this bill actually accomplishing?
I go first.
And you can both comment on it.
No, happy to. I try to be a gentleman here. It is to say to people that yes, houses of worship and cemeteries are important, but schools and community centers are also identifiable places for certain groups, and that touching those institutions would affect a community as much as a threat or a hate crime against a synagogue or a mosque or church. The latest example I can give you is that yesterday there were across North America specific threats made against JCCs, Jewish community centers. So there were not synagogues being threatened, there were Jewish community centers. I can tell you that everywhere in the Jewish world, very, very quickly, things got put into place. Security experts were brought in, but the entire community, all across North America, was okay. Are we touched? Are we a potential target? And again, we cannot underestimate this. So let's say you're a parent and you have to bring your children to a swimming lesson at the local JCC, and you hear that there's a threat or against JCCs generally. You're going to think, okay, am I going to leave my kid there? Is it dangerous? So the message of hate targeted at a non-religious institution, but a link to a religious community can be also very disturbing and affect a lot of people.
I guess what I'm wondering is the people that do these kinds of things, does something like this really matter to them?
Well, does something like this matter to them? I think that, to Richard's point, the fact that perhaps a non-religious building, but for example, a building that's within the Jewish community, the fact that that building is being targeted like a JCC, it's because it's Jewish. It's very, very important for society to acknowledge when there's hate-motivated factors in a crime. And in fact, it's very disturbing for our community, and I'm certain for many other communities out there, if, say, a mischief was addressed, but the hate-motivating factors were not addressed by a court, because at the end of the day, then there's a sense of letdown and perhaps betrayal by the criminal justice system to a community that, hey, the motivating factors were not addressed here. The reason why non-religious buildings are targeted often in our community is because of the hate-motivated factor, and that should certainly be addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting point. It's sort of like minimum mandatory sentences, right? Is anybody going to not commit a crime because of what the sentencing is? I think there's a larger message. Ms. Crow.
Thank you very much. And I just, 29 years ago, I was elected to North York City Council, and the first committee that I was put on was North York Race Relations Committee. And everywhere through my progress in elected office until here, we've talked a lot about race relations, we've talked about hate, and we've talked about these things. And And I supported your motion, Mr. Marceau, in 2006, then Ms. Freeman's, Ms. Jennings, and Mr. Garneau. And so I'm sad to see that we're dealing with this issue today when we tried to deal with it so many other times. Because clearly you have to close every loophole and do everything you can to possibly, one is to educate people and to talk about what respect is and all of those reasons. I can only wonder what kind of world we would have lived in if, I know for the last 29 years there were a lot of people in our country working on these issues of sensitizing each other to the needs and so on of other communities. Whether it's a school that gets vandalized with hate crimes and so on, or it's just any building, period. And I think some of these folks who have that kind of built-up hatred in them won't matter if it is a mosque or a temple or a synagogue. They'll just find a place to plaster their terrible message. So anything that we can be doing to bring in enforcement and things to make people pay attention. We've got to send that much more positive message out there to the world, which is a much more respectful one. But there are those people that just don't get it because they have their own malice. So I think having 305, if it closes the loophole and tightens it up every little bit more, that's just one more thing that needs to be done. And I just found it odd that I end up the committee today and you're dealing with this issue. And it just makes me sad that in our country, we're still having to deal with the kind of anti-Semitism. North York is my city, and we're still dealing with it, you know? And it takes each and every one of us to push back. So 305 is another little step in closing any opportunities and sending that message that this kind of stuff is not acceptable. And we'll put all the support we can behind the police department because it's a very difficult issue for them to be able to get enough evidence to be able to actually lay the charges. But I think we need to do that.
First of all, it's hard for me to believe that you started elected politics 29 years ago. And I very much appreciate your support on C-305 and the previous iterations of the bill. I am not in any way naive in thinking that we're going to stop hate crime with this or any piece of legislation. I can tell you, however, that yes, there are bad people. Those people should be punished. We should use every deterrent that we can. But generally speaking, and very generally speaking, Canadians are good people. And we see it when there was that horrible attack in Quebec City. The swell of support to our Muslim brother and sister in Canada was overwhelming and amazing to see. When we see attacks on the Jewish Community Center and synagogues here in Ottawa, where everybody went on that Saturday at the Synagogue Marziki Adas to support it, we had local politicians, municipal, federal, provincial, and members of every community being there. When the United Church was vandalized a few months earlier, and the following Saturday, members of every denominations were there to support the United Church that was attacked. There's lots of good in Canada, and I'm finishing on that. So let's build on this, and let's not forget, despite that we deal with ugly stuff, that we have lots of good in this country.
Okay, so now we have two more questioners. So very short question, very short answer, please. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Marceau, I was really glad to hear of the work and the support you've given to Bill C-16 and my colleague Randall Garrison and his work on that. And I think we've identified that in this bill, gender expression is missing. But one just quick question I had to you: in Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code, one of the aggravating factors is also on the basis of sex. Do you think that should be included in this specific part? Because in my writing, I have a building, Cowichan Women Against Violence. It's a women's organization specifically there to help women out of abusive relationships. And if someone were to target that building just because it is helping women, do you think that is a key element that's missing within Section 4.1?
So when Bill C-384 was debated between 2006 and 2008, that was the main thing that was pushed by members of Parliament at the time, and it's certainly something that I would encourage this committee to consider. Women's shelters or women's building, or based on gender, is certainly something that I would look at if I were sitting in your shoes.
Excellent. Dernière question, Monsieur Boissonneau.
Monsieur Marceau, j'aimerais juste souligner l'appui.
Mr. Marceau, I'd just like to talk about the support that the Jewish community gives this bill.
That was non-LGBTQ, because the statement at the time was human rights are for everyone, and that we all have to stand together. And I see you doing that again today, both organizations, so thank you to you both. Quick question to you. You mentioned that this is not a panacea. You mentioned that there are other tools that we need to avail ourselves of. Any quick recommendation for other legislative tools at the disposal, particularly of our committee, that you would like us to be considering?
Well, I'm a bit surprised by the question. I'm sorry. Can I get back to you on this? Because as of now, I think this will that would cover the what I think is the main gap in hate crime legislation. But let me get back to you on that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to get back to you as well. And the only thing I would add is that an offense such as this is a very cowardly offense. This is something that's usually done, under the cover of darkness. Unfortunately, I know you were talking about your experiences in the past. We live in a social media age where people don't have to interact directly with one another, and perhaps if they did, they treat each other as more human. And so there's a great societal reasons that you want to say that behavior like this is abhorrent and will not be tolerated in Canada.
Thank you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Mr. Mostyn, Monsieur Marceau, your testimony was very, very helpful to the committee. We want to thank you for coming. It is incredibly appreciated. We're going to take a short pause to change panels, and we will resume in 2 minutes, or maybe 2.5. So we are reconvening the meeting and coming back to order. So I would like to welcome our next witnesses. Representing the Pride Center of Edmonton, we have Mr. Mickey Wilson, who's the Executive Director. Welcome, Mr. Wilson. And representing himself as an individual, we have Mr. Christopher Wells, who is the Assistant Professor and Faculty Director for the Institute of Sexual Minority Studies and Services at the University of Alberta. Welcome, Mr. Wells. So I think the two of you have agreed that Mr. Wells is going to go first. So Mr. Wells, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and to our colleagues who presented before as well. It's great to see the solidarity between communities talking about such an important issue of hate and bias in our country. I believe that the proposed amendments of Bill C-305 are important to the preservation and protection of Canada's increasingly diverse, multicultural and pluralistic identities, especially as we increasingly express and make visible our diverse identities and values directly through our public institutions. As emphasized by Member of Parliament Randall Garrison, I believe Bill C-305 should not only include sexual orientation and gender identity, but also gender expression as prohibited grounds for the offence of mischief, which aligns with the current changes proposed by Bill C-16, an act to amend Canada's human rights and the Criminal Code, which includes both gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds of discrimination. Transgender individuals experience some of the highest rates of violence, discrimination, and prejudice in our society. Unfortunately, in Canada, we have no way for law enforcement to track, charge, or specifically prosecute hate or discrimination that is motivated by gender identity or gender expression. Trans lives matter and are worthy of protection. This critical absence must be addressed. It is vitally important to recognize and protect the LGBT community in similar ways as other cultural, racialized, or visible minority communities that are vulnerable to hate, prejudice, and discrimination because of an identifiable characteristic of person. Much discrimination against LGBTQ people is actually based on their gender expression and the assumptions that are made as to what it means to be stereotypically male, female, or perceived as neither. It has been said that homophobia and transphobia are one of the most powerful weapons of sexism, misogyny, and privilege in our society. LGBTQ individuals are often considered to be invisible minorities because they may not reveal their true identities unless they feel safe. This is why the LGBT community organizations like Pride or Rainbow Centers, growing cultural celebrations such as Pride festivals, and specific LGBTQ-identified neighborhoods or enclaves are all critically important safe spaces. These safe spaces are often visibly marked with rainbow flags to indicate inclusion, acceptance, and support. Indeed, it was a remarkable historical moment to witness the rainbow pride flag raised over Parliament Hill last June. This was a strong and visible signal to the world that Canada supports our LGBTQ communities both at home and abroad. The challenge of the proposed amendments in Bill C-305 will be in establishing clear definitions as to what is meant by administrative, social, cultural, or sports activities or events. For example, many hate crimes and incidents happen in specific LGBTQ-identified neighborhoods and at community or social events. Places like Church Street in Toronto, Davie Street in Vancouver, and St. Catherine Street in Montreal all represent clearly identified and civically supported LGBTQ neighborhoods. Would these areas receive the same protection that is proposed by Bill C-305? I believe clarity is needed to ensure that these and other important community gathering places, such as Pride festivals, which can draw tens of thousands, or in the case of Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver's Pride Festival, hundreds of thousands of people together. Sadly, these celebrations of diversity also make them prime targets for hate and extremism. While mischief or crimes to property are one of the most common forms of hate crimes in Canada, most hate crimes against the LGBT community are not to property, but directly target individuals in the form of physical and sexual assaults and murder. Indeed, recent hate crime statistics indicate that of all the reported hate crimes committed in Canada, those targeting the LGBTQ community are among the most violent in nature and require serious medical attention. It's not one stab wound, but 40, as these individuals are not seen as persons, but as objects to be destroyed. Sadly, only 1 in 10 hate crimes are ever reported to law enforcement. By attacking vulnerable individuals, most hate crimes are designed to instill fear and terror into entire communities. They strike at the very heart of what we believe an inclusive democracy should be, which is to live one's life openly without threat or fear. The proposed amendments to Bill C-305 raise several further questions. Will commercial spaces, such as LGBTQ-identified businesses, be protected under the legislation? Places like bars and nightclubs have been important and historical spaces of refuge and resistance for the LGBTQ community. In some cases, they were the only safe spaces that existed in many communities. Our modern pride movement is said to have emanated out of the police raids of the Stonewall Inn, an infamous bar in New York City. And now, thanks to one of the final acts of President Obama, has been recognized as the first national LGBTQ monument in the United States. Stonewall marked the beginning of a newfound source of community identity and activism. Those fateful riots in June of 1969 are the reason why many Pride festivals are held around the world today. The recent Pulse nightclub tragedy in Orlando, which took the lives of 49 innocent people and wounded 53 others, occurred in a gay-identified nightclub. This is another very recent and tragic example of the extreme hate and violence still directed toward the LGBT community. There have been more than 25 documented direct attacks on LGBTQ-identified spaces where people came to find community and love, but where they were met with hate and death. Perhaps rather than the piecemeal amendments to the Criminal Code of Canada, all of which are well intended to address hate and prejudice, it's time for a different and more comprehensive approach. In Canada, law enforcement agencies still do not have a common operational definition of hate crimes, which causes challenges in police investigations, reporting, and the accurate collection of important national data. This is why there should be a specific hate crime section and universal definition included in the Criminal Code of Canada. For example, a possible uniform definition might be: a hate crime is an offense committed against a person or property which is motivated, in whole or in part, to harm or instill hatred towards an identifiable group based on real or perceived race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, gender, gender identity, gender expression, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, or any other similar factor. The addition of a specific hate crime section in the Criminal Code of Canada, which could be in similar form to the current section on terrorism, section 83.01, and the education and application of this new hate crime section by police agencies and justice officials will ensure that Canada's diverse communities understand that our government not only advocates and supports peaceful coexistence between communities, but also enforces the full extent of the law against hate mongers and extremist groups whose goal is to attack diversity and difference and tear away at Canada's very social fabric. While the proposed amendments to Section 430 are important, hate is not only a crime against property. Rather, it disproportionately impacts people, many of whom are the most vulnerable in our society. We must do more to protect and support our most vulnerable and marginalized communities. One look around the world shows us that hate and extremism are on the rise. The question is, what will be our response to this growing threat? As we've recently and tragically witnessed, Canada is not immune. We must do more to protect our diverse communities, and we must do more to give law enforcement the appropriate tools to adequately investigate, track, and prosecute hate-motivated crimes, regardless if they attack property or persons. It is time for us to have a much broader conversation about hate and extremism in Canada, and I hope this private member's bill will do just that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wells. And over to you, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and for having us here to discuss this important bill. I want to begin by saying that I don't usually spend my time parsing out bills and exploring in depth that kind of work, building policy. I work in a community center. I've spent my life, 30 years of my life, working in the LGBT, queer, and trans communities. volunteering for community-based organizations, and as now a paid employee, executive director of the Pride Center in Edmonton. Our agency serves approximately 5,000 unique individuals every year. And in our outreach program, we provide education to the larger community to more people than that every year. We deliver our programs to government, not-for-profits, schools, churches, senior centers, and places of all kinds, businesses in the broader community. But it's also important to know that I am a retired clergy person. So I have a deep understanding of the connection between faith and LGBTQ community, and the social construct of faith and its importance in the life of all communities. In my 20 years of active ministry, I served only 2 congregations. One was in the inner city of Edmonton, largely homeless people, mostly Indigenous. The second congregation was queer and trans, in a place that we shared with other spaces. Most of the time that I was in those congregations, we did not use traditional worship space. We rented ad hoc, we met by the grace of others, and certainly occupied spaces that would not necessarily be described in this bill. As part of my volunteer work, I was fortunate to work with the board of EGAL Canada, and for 5 years I was the chair of their National Trans Committee. During that time, the EGAL study, Every Class in Every School, was undertaken and released in 2011. It was the first study of its kind, and it exposed astounding statistics related to harassment, violence, and the perceived lack of safety. In addition, the study found that Caucasian youth, both LGBT and non-LGBT, experience significantly less physical violence and harassment, 8% compared to 13% of Aboriginal students and 15% of youth of color. This is significant because there is an aggregate effect, or kind of a double whammy, that they experience. Not only are they at risk because of their gender or sexual orientation, but also because of their ethnicity. In 2014, the Trans Pulse study on trans people in Ontario found even more alarming statistics related to trans and non-binary people. But significantly, the research showed that the experience of discrimination can result in exclusion from social spaces, can result in unemployment, avoidance of health care, and poor mental health. The study also revealed the impact of intersecting oppressions, such as one's trans identity, gender, and being part of a racialized community, and it produces the same aggregate effect. Although physical assault and violence is not what's being addressed in Bill C-305, the experience of hate-motivated mischief is likely to have the same aggregate effect, where multiple categories of identity intersect. Research also indicates that LGBTQ people worry more about being victims of discrimination than others. And research shows that, in fact, we anticipate it in our lives often on a daily basis. The resulting minority stress has a collective impact that is particularly noticeable when there is an incident of violence, harassment, or mischief. In the past 5 years, I've seen fag and homo sprayed on a vehicle in my neighborhood, notes posted on windows and doors using slurs about all kinds of people, vehicles burned, and windows broken. They were my windows. The other side of that coin is the impact of acknowledgement of the reality of our vulnerability and our value as citizens. The inclusion of rights and validation for LGBTQ identities at legislative levels empowers and strengthens queer and trans people, both individually but also collectively. I've seen this in my life over and over again, from the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1969, which is when I was just coming out, and the amendment of Human Rights Act in my home province of Alberta to include gender identity and gender expression in December of 2015. In reading Bill C-305, I'm uncertain exactly which buildings and in which context this amendment might address or perhaps should address. But I do know that hate-based mischief has the same result regardless of where it happens, whether it is in a religious setting, a community center, a women's organization, or a community group of Indigenous folk, people of color, a gathering place for queer and trans people, or words posted on the door of a senior's room in a senior's facility. These kinds of legislation send strong messages. To those that enact hate-motivated mischief as a society, it says we reject this kind of action. It may not stop the action, but it says it's not okay, that it is unacceptable. To the vulnerable, the message is much stronger. It's that we matter. And that's really the most important thing of all. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson, and I thank you both for your comments. And now we're going to go to questions. So we're going to start with Mr. Falk.
Great, thank you for attending committee today. And Mr. Wilson, I have some questions I'd like to ask you. Looking at the legislation, you've obviously had a chance to study it a little bit. Do you think that the legislation addresses the concerns that you've identified in your presentation?
I think it addresses some of them, certainly. I'm not sure that it would clearly identify some of the issues that the LGBTQ community might experience in terms of mischief. A lot of mischief crime would happen in personal residence and against personal property. It certainly would happen in spaces that are occasionally used, perhaps, for our purposes. So somebody knows that a hall is rented for an LGBT facility during Pride. An event could happen there. And it wouldn't be a regular use or a primary use. So I think there are some, perhaps, gaps in it. I'm not sure how to close that gap. That's not my job. But I certainly do see that it might not meet all of the needs of this community.
Okay. Yeah, you've identified exactly in the amendments A, B, C, and D the word primarily there. You've indicated that that may be problematic for, especially in the context of your communities. And you're suggesting maybe that should be considered more carefully and perhaps altered, or?
I think so. In reading it, I wondered if it needed to be there at all. I think if there's a crime of mischief that happens and there was a group in there that's an identifiable group that's been targeted, then it shouldn't matter whether that's its primary use or not, in my mind.
In the previous panel that we had here, we talked, and Ms. Khalid had asked the initial question about how this legislation may act as a deterrent. And based on your testimony and your experience, do you think this bit of legislation would be a deterrent? And if so, how do you think it would play out?
One could only hope that hate was stopped by deterrence, but it most often isn't. I do believe that it certainly puts the message out there. People who are perhaps could be swayed, may be swayed because it's there. But unfortunately, I don't believe most hate is swayed by legislation or law.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Falk. We're going to go to Mr. Boissonneau.
Chair, well, thank you both for traveling to Ottawa. It's really important for us to have your perspective from the LGBTQ2 community and also a perspective from the West, particularly from Alberta and Edmonton. During my recent community conversations, I met researchers across the country, and in Vancouver, I met with the Stigma and Resilience Among Vulnerable Youth Centre, known as CEREVIC, and I asked a direct question. How can we save the lives of queer and Indigenous youth? How can we stop the suicides? And Jennifer is one of the researchers, took out a research study and said, here's the proof. We need safe spaces and we need symbols. And what youth need is they need to know there's a space where they can be safe to be who they are, but they need the symbols that identify that those safe spaces exist. So the kind of pride flags, trans flags that you have on Camp Firefly, on the Isthmus office, on the Pride Centre, what Vancouver City is now doing with all of its rec centres, having the safe spaces there, these are important. But as you mentioned quite eloquently in both your remarks, that turns those spaces and those gatherings then into targets. And what's important for me to know, and what I'd like to ask you is, how do we, not just with legislation, but with other tools at our disposal, attack some of these root issues? And Chris, you were very blunt that we need a wholesale review. And you don't have to take my words for it. In StatsCan, the last 2013 data shows that 16% of hate crimes were motivated by hatred based on sexual orientation. That makes our community the third most targeted after race, ethnicity, and religion. And so I applaud Mr. Arya for including this, going this far. So Chris, my question to you, Mr. Wells, is what would the substantive and symbolic impacts for the LGBTQ2IS community be if sexual orientation and gender identity are added to this section? Then I'll have a question for Mickey and then a question for both of you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think at its face, it says you matter. You exist. When we name people, we give them personhood. We recognize that they have rights, that they're full, contributing, and valued members of our society. We also recognize as a government that this is a distinct, vulnerable community in our society. We certainly wish it wasn't that way, but that's a reality. And these changes are symbolic. They expand the conversation. They enlarge the space of inclusion in our country. But I think they can also be substantive in giving some of those tools to law enforcement, to our prosecutors, to send out those strong messages when these crimes do happen, that they're going to be taken very seriously because of the differential impact that they have. As has been said time and time again, these are not crimes, even though they might target property, they target an entire group of people. And that message reverberates strong and loud, and then makes people feel that they have to be silent and invisible, makes them feel less safe to be able to go into those identified safe spaces.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, how would the addition of sexual orientation and gender identity affect the Pride Centre of Edmonton and other like organizations across the country? And how would these proposed additions impact member of the trans community and gender diverse Canadians?
Well, I think it's really clear that when people can see themselves in legislation, they're more likely to feel empowered. Most queer and trans people don't report hate crimes or hate incidents or bias incidents that happen in the community because they don't think anybody will listen. They don't think anybody really cares about whether or not I got called the name or was threatened in a washroom because I'm trans or any of those kinds of things. So what it does is it says I do matter, that my government has taken my life into consideration and has said it's important enough to put on paper and to create a bar that's met by law. What it would mean to the Pride Centre, certainly it would make us feel safer. We haven't had this round of occupation, the current space that we have, anything pasted to our doors or anything like that, but we have received letters that we do report, and they sit in my cabinet, telling us that we're evil, that we need to repent, that we're going to hell, that we shouldn't exist. Gender diverse people are perhaps the most marginalized among us. Trans women are underemployed or unemployed. Trans women of color are murdered violently. They're beaten. Trans people are struggle every step of the way. I would say that we face injustice at every turn. I can't say there isn't a day go by that we don't have to deal with some sort of conflict or confrontation in our lives. On my trip here this morning, I had to have a conversation with the airport screeners about who I am. So it's every day. And I think that the government acknowledges who we are and says that people don't have a right to mistreat us or commit crimes against our property or the spaces that we're in. Is really significant.
we're working very hard to make sure that you feel safer every day. You know that, and I know you're part of the conversation. Mr. Chair, 30 seconds, a minute left. How much do I have? Am I done?
Well, you actually have no time left, but
Darn.
if you have 30 seconds, I'm happy to give it to you.
So
30 seconds.
maybe answer this in another part. 40% of youth, homeless youth are LGBTQ2. We have seniors, LGBTQ seniors, going into seniors facilities being recloseted. As our government starts to make more spaces for LGBTQ seniors and to help get all kids off the street, but certainly LGBTQ youth as well, how does this kind of a provision make those spaces safer in your minds?
Well, we know hate is a learned value, right? And the reality is that the large majority of hate crimes are committed by youth, against youth. These are crimes under the age of 25. So if hate is a learned value, the real question comes down to what are we teaching our children? And where are they learning that it's okay to hate and attack other people? So a lot of this has to start with the conversations we're having with our families around dinner tables. We're seeing this conversation happen right now in the National Hockey League, through February being designated as Hockey is for Everyone Month. And our organization, along with others in Calder Bateman, have created Pride Tape as a visible way that NHL players and role models can wrap their sticks in rainbow hockey tape to say that we're allies, that we're going to stand against discrimination. We're going to create spaces of inclusion. So I think while we're talking about changes to the criminal code, we're talking about all those little changes, the micro practices where individuals and organizations step up and denounce hate and prejudice, because that's how culture will change. You know, this is an important first step, but I really believe it's about education, cultural change, and the kinds of conversations we're having.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I very much appreciate both of your testimonies today, and thank you for coming to Ottawa to give them. Professor Wells, I was really glad to hear in your testimony when you were talking about sort of the piecemeal approach to the criminal code. And you know, the criminal code is a vast piece of federal legislation. I mean, it clocks in, I think, at over 1,300 pages. And every time I review it, I find myself jumping around from section to section because there can be sections that are separated by 500 pages that deal with the same area. And, you know, I know the intention behind Bill C-305 is a very noble one, but I think you did raise some concerns in your testimony about, you know, are you, with these very specific definitions, going to leave some spaces out? And, you know, Section 718.2 allows a judge to impose harsher penalties if it's motivated by hatred based on a few characteristics. I do note that as the way it's currently written, gender identity and expression is not included, but do you think, like, perhaps, would that be a better way to go, to put it in there, to make it a bit broader and more, like a judge more able to interpret it? Because I know when you were testifying about this specific section and you raised the prospect of businesses which are easily identifiable, would they be excluded? Neighborhoods in Vancouver and Toronto, they are not covered in this legislation, but they are identified as places where the trans community hangs out to feel safe. It is their community. So just some of your thoughts on that.
I think you're right. I think this inevitably happens with legislation that is amended over time. Sections don't necessarily read together, and they're difficult to find. If judges are having a hard time finding various sections, ones that are current or no longer on the books, I'm not sure how everyday ordinary citizens are to be able to interpret that. That's why there is a proposal to add a specific hate crime section to the criminal code that will consolidate all of this together. It will make a stronger statement to individuals and as a nation about how we understand hate. We've certainly done that with terrorism. It also provides clear guidance, and it gives greater opportunity to educate law enforcement as well. We know right now that there are special prosecutors who deal specifically with hate because of the complexity of being able to prove motivation, who's included, who's not included. The fact that we don't even have a standardized definition of what a hate crime is in Canada, to me, is unconscionable. How are we going to really get at the intent of the changes to the criminal code when we have police departments all across the country operating with different understandings?
It's like the elephant in the room not being addressed by this piece.
And I know there is support. It's just a matter of us making this a priority. And I do believe now is the time for us in this country, when we see the state of the world before us, that this is a serious discussion we should be having. How do we consolidate our approach against hate, whether that's the criminal code and other resources we have. We know there are great models across Canada of hate crimes units. Some are focused within police services, others have a coordination provincially, but do we have that nationally as well? And I think a lot of what happens is we shift that off into forms of extremism and terrorism, but we're talking about hate and terrorism can and are different things. Right? They can be related, but they can also be very separate as well. When we talk about hate, we're often talking about targeting vulnerable individuals. When we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about entire classes or groups of people as well. So I believe that this legislation is important. I believe it's a step in the right direction. I think it's a conversation that we need to strongly carry forward.
And I'll get you to add on to anything, Mr. Wilson, but just a quick thing I wanted to get in before you close your testimony. So, do you feel that C305, if we can find a way to throw in those amendments to identify businesses or any kind of a gathering place, do you think that would make it a more worthwhile bill and still worth pursuing, despite the need for defining hate crimes more generally?
I do. I think that for the LGBT community is those commercial spaces. The legislation like this, if we had a tragedy like happened with the Pulse nightclub, we'd be wondering, does this apply or not? So we can learn the lessons of history and move forward in a proactive way. Perhaps we talk about celebratory spaces as well. And we talked a little bit about that definition. Once we start to get so specific of naming the grounds, maybe we also need to add, that phrase, and other similar factors, so that over time we won't have to reopen these sections of the code that they can be interpreted to be within.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, anything you'd like to add?
I think the only thing I would add is that there is opportunity for imposing a harsher sentence if hate is seen as a motivating factor, but that doesn't happen very often, even when hate is known to be a motivating factor. So I think that's a problem, because then we don't know, nobody knows that hate was a motivating factor, and it's not captured anywhere. So I think that's a problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. McKinnon?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for your testimony today. Professor Wells, you mentioned gender expression was missing from 4.1. Could you speak about how the addition of that would augment or improve this bill, and what effect it might have?
Absolutely. I believe it's been said it should parallel C16. As I mentioned, many people are targeted because of their gender expression, because they're not performing of what it means to be societally acceptable as being a male or female, or what happens when you're gender diverse. Those is a group of individuals who can be at some of the most extreme risk, as my colleague has mentioned. So I think as we're changing one part of the criminal code, we have the opportunity to be consistent. I think it's prudent. I think there's been lots of conversation around that. And the difference is now I think we're getting a better understanding between gender identity and what gender expression is, and how they both create vulnerability of individuals who maybe operate outside of the male-female binary. We see this as more of a fluidity that's happening in our society. I always say go to our students or our young people and go to Facebook, and there's not just 2 gender choices, there's over 50. As a professor who works in this area, my students are my best educators on what is current and how they're identifying these days.
I take notice of your discussion, the broader discussion about hate crimes and so forth. However, unfortunately, we have to deal with a very narrow aspect of that, which is the subject of this bill. So this bill is activated upon mischief being visited upon buildings that are identified in some cases very broadly, in some cases very narrowly, and the attendant surroundings of that. I'm wondering if and whether it's a primary use or a partial use is kind of, something we need to talk about. I'm wondering if that needs to be expanded to include other spaces, whether it needs to be included, to include private property. I'm wondering if it was expanded to include places, buildings, structures that are targeted because of their perceived use or association, whether in whole or in part with the listed groups, or whether that's perhaps too broad.
I would certainly support that. I give the example of someone putting a rainbow flag in their window or on their front yard and then being targeted because they have signaled their support for the LGBT community or identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. And that doesn't just target them, that targets all of their friends, their relatives, because it's motivated by a specific characteristic of person. I think that's really what we're getting at here. This is not an ordinary crime. This is a crime motivated out of malice, out of prejudice, out of bias.
Okay. I had a question. I've lost my question. I guess one of the things I'm concerned about is that, not all speech. Some speech is very hateful, but it's within the realm of free speech. So the danger here, I guess, is expanding the scope of buildings, the category of buildings, is start to encroach upon free speech, in which then we might run into charter challenges. So I'm wondering if you would like to comment on either of you would like to comment on that.
I think there's been lots of comments on speech, certainly, and not an easy issue to resolve. But I do think we have, case law that's sort of started to make those definitions. I think, here we're talking about aspects of graffiti. We're talking about, violence enacted on spaces. We're talking about, things like firebombing, damage to property, which is different than the notion of freedom of speech. It's certainly something we cherish and value at the university. It's something I hold as being dearly important to have that voice. And because there are many times when I speak out that people are calling our president of the university to have me fired because they don't like an LGBTQ perspective being shared on issues. So I think in a democratic society, it's really important that we aren't limiting that space, but that at the same time we're finding the balance to protect vulnerable communities, particularly when it comes to moving from freedom of speech to propagating hate.
Okay. I guess one final question is, do you see this as a tool that would be useful for law enforcement? Do you think this will help them if we expand this in this way?
I can't personally speak for law enforcement, but I think it would be another useful tool. I think it sends another very powerful message. I think these kinds of changes are only as good as the education that's provided afterwards, the implementation. So the question of the training and the awareness, we still have many police officers and Crown out there who don't have a good understanding of what hate and bias is in our society. And I think that's a conversation that hopefully will be strengthened as these amendments go forward.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKinnon. Again, we don't have time for a full round, but if people have short questions, I'm happy to let them ask them and get some short answers, hopefully. And I think Mr. Arnold had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. I guess this is my first really close look at this bill, and I've seen over the last while here a lot of discussions over trying to define things fairly tightly by inclusiveness. And by including some things, then what is not included becomes the prominent portion of the discussion. And in this bill, I see the word primarily used for, or primarily used, and in sections A, B, and C, I wonder why that word is even in there, because to take the word primarily out of it would certainly make it apply in all cases. The only problem might be in paragraph D. I'm just wondering if our witnesses may have a comment to that.
Certainly, I said earlier that I'm not sure that word needs to be there. I think it limits the opportunity to use this bill more effectively. There are places that are used occasionally. As Chris was talking, I was thinking about the straight-owned business that is an ally to the community and has a rainbow flag in their window, and that could be targeted just because that flag is there, right? So I think there's a lot of limitations when we put the word primarily, because that business might not have anything to do with our community other than it's supportive and is indicating welcome, and yet it could be targeted just because it has that symbol there. So I think it creates some limitations.
Thank you.
Arnold, anyone else who have any questions? Mr. Boissonneau?
It's tangential, and I hope the chair will allow it, but it speaks to the work that you do in both your organizations. When you have to respond to an attack or a broken window or something, it takes money, it takes funding, and when you support 5,000 people, that takes funding. So I'm curious to know what federal funding, if any, your organizations receive to do your good work.
I have to agree with Mr. Boissonneau that is incredibly tangential, and we're supposed to be discussing the scope of a bill. So perhaps you could phrase that is there any money that you know of in the bill that you would get, and if not, what other ways have you gotten money or something? But I'll be pretty flexible. That's a huge stretch. But given that it's late hour, let's hear the answer.
We receive no federal funding.
Funding is always helpful, and the primary goal of a lot of the funding is it's the education and the implementation of government legislation. As we mentioned, it's one thing to pass the legislation; it's another thing to ensure for its effective and intended uses, and people are knowledgeable about that. So I think it's important. Anytime we're talking about legislation, it's what's the implementation plan and what are the resources that are going to be put behind it to actually make it successful.
Thank you. Other questions related to the bill? I actually have one, if that's okay with the members of the committee. I've been listening, and I fully understand what you were both saying in terms of the targeting of, for example, an allied business that's flying the pride flag, or targeting somebody's home, which happens in all communities. But do you see a distinction between the targeting, for example, of an LGBT community center or an office that clearly represents a group within the community, or and I also construction and agree that if there's a building that's been rented out on a one-time purpose during Pride Week and everybody knows it's an LGBT event, that there's an attack with vandalism, versus somebody's private home, where in no case for religious purposes or other purposes do we recognize that as being subject to this provision?
No, I think to be really blunt, no. The ripple through the community is the same. If somebody's home is vandalized and that's a member of our community, we all wonder who's next. We wonder if that person's going to get caught, because most often they aren't. We wonder if they are caught, if they'll be prosecuted, and often they're not. So I would say the impact is more about scale, perhaps, than it is whether there is impact or not.
Okay.
Yeah. I would agree. Part of the challenge is when we start to parse people from places as well, right? People's identities are not so easily divided. I think we're talking about identity-based crimes, and so it doesn't matter necessarily where they happen. The impact that they have, targeting the very essence of who a person is what's behind the reason why we have hate crimes and legislation to begin with. So I'm particularly concerned about some of those commercial spaces that de facto serve as community spaces through this legislation, as I've mentioned, through many of the bars and nightclubs that due to circumstances of history have been fugitive spaces, have been the only spaces I can well recall walking down back alleys without doors because it wasn't safe to put a sign up to say that this was a gay establishment. How far Canada has come. And I think right now we have a real opportunity to even strengthen Canada's leadership on LGBTQ issues, on human rights issues, not just domestically, but internationally. There is a void currently globally, and I certainly hope that this government will not have any fear to step into that void, because, as has been said, the world needs more of Canada right now.
So just to follow up, because I understand what you're saying, and I'm just trying to better understand. So basically, the way the bill is currently worded, for example, as I read it, anyways, unless you're defining it as a social, space, a gay nightclub wouldn't be covered by the current provisions of the bill. But what you're saying is that is just as much a gathering space and a safe space for the gay community as a Mennonite cultural center or a Jewish cultural center, because that's where the community identifies, feels comfortable with one another, and can gather, and it should be treated equally as the other spaces that are set out here. Is that right?
Absolutely, and so it's in the definitions to wonder if would that be covered under a social space, or is that somebody to look and go see that's a commercial space that doesn't apply. I'd hate to see something like that happen or be said to a community that is suffering and that is hurting right now. And we know that those kinds of spaces are the ones that are most likely to be targeted and attacked.
Thank you. That helps a lot.
I think if we recall the Pulse nightclub incident, that was one of the conversations that existed in our community. This was a space that people assumed they would be safe, and somebody else came in and took that safety away. Right, so it's all of the spaces. Safety is so important for all the identifiable groups, and safe space for queer and trans people is not so easily identifiable sometimes by a particular institution.
Understood. Not seeing any more questions. I want to thank both of you for your compelling testimony today. Thank you for helping us in our study of the bill, and thank you for coming in all the way from Western Canada. Meeting adjourned.